Hello, afternoon. Uh, Happy to be back.
Yeah, lots going on.
Yeah, as a fair amount has happened. I had a child. That was a thing.
It
And
sure
I
was.
still have a child, by the way.
You
It's not
do,
like
you do. You birthed the
I.
child,
But yes, I birthed a child. That happened.
the
So,
most precious child.
well, I'm partial to her, but
Definitely.
yeah. But yeah, glad to be back. This week's episode, we're going to be talking about existential OCD and bringing it back to existential OCD, but this week talking about compulsions because the last week that we talked many weeks ago now was part one.
Yeah.
And then we thought we were going to do part two before I left on leave, and my little friend decided to join us early. So here
Yeah.
we are.
She came knocking on a little
She,
soon.
she was not interested in waiting any longer,
No.
as it turned out.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah. So do you, where do we want to begin with the compulsions of the existential, or did I miss anything in terms of re I don't know, acclimating us to everything?
I don't here's the problem. I'm trying to remember what we talked about specifically with the obsessions because I think that would be helpful in being more clear and precise. But
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know that it's been a while, but I also know that we probably tend to talk about the same things in
that's
terms of
true.
obsessions. So, um, you
That's
know,
just my brain trying to be perfectionistic, and that's silly.
I understand. Well, no, I don't understand. Just kidding. Um, so yeah, so I mean, when we talked last time, I'm presuming that Kelly and Lauren from 3 months ago talked about the element of fear of death, fear of the afterlife, the fears related to
Existence,
existence,
meaning.
meaning. Yeah, I was going to say meaning, purpose, um, the very nature of reality, right? So a lot of
Mhm.
the Matrix stuff and the Truman Show and the all that fun stuff.
So
Um, yeah, not
not fun. Ugh.
not fun. Um, so yeah, I think maybe going off of those
Yeah,
types of obsessions as we talk about the compulsions probably makes sense.
yeah, that's great. Way to s
Brilliant.
way to launch us to success, Lauren.
Bam.
Bingo.
Thanks. I do what I
Alright.
can. So, yeah, I mean, obviously there are so many different compulsions that can come up with this subtype.
Yes. Um, so oftentimes we talk about, like, the people with existential obsessions, maybe like the philosophers of the OCD world.
Hmm.
And it's not, like, totally off the nose there to see people who, like, major in philosophy and they're spinning out on existence and meaning and purpose. But
Yeah.
a lot of it can be research, looking into things like, is there a heaven? Is there a hell? What's the science behind all of this? Is this just what should I do? How do I find meaning and purpose?
Yeah.
Um, if we're going into more of like the Truman Matrix type stuff, it can be, trying to do like reality, quote unquote, reality testing,
Hmm.
like looking to see if somebody's looking at you strangely.
Yes. Yeah.
Touching
Checking.
things, touching, making sure everything is, the wall is really standing there.
Yeah. Or even touching your, like, it's like pinching yourself, right?
Yourself.
But like touching like your hand and
Yes.
being like, is this even my hand? Right.
Mhm.
Or that kind of thing, for sure. And
Uh,
I think also to that end, like we talk about checking sort of physically and looking in our surroundings or like touching things to make sure. But then there's also this emotional checking that starts to take place of like, do I feel real?
mm.
I mean, whatever that means.
be. It's so fun.
But that like sort of spacey experience that comes with dissociation, which I know we did talk about last time, the element of dissociation being this huge trigger for a lot of people with this subtype.
Mhm.
Um, if you have the experience of sort of being out of your body, or and I like to think of it almost as a hyper awareness of your reality. That's really what those
Yes,
dissociative states boil down to, is like,
so
wow, I'm
true.
very aware. um that happens, and there's that discomfort that comes with that, and also this concern, what if this feeling means that I'm living in the Truman Show, or this is the Matrix, right? And I'm experiencing a glitch in the Matrix or whatever, like, or yeah, you might
Yeah.
have deja vu, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, is
Oh,
it the Matrix? Yeah.
yeah. The dissociation piece is a really big trigger and a common one that I see anyways. And people I do find tend to research all the different, like, what causes dissociation, and is this really OCD? Is this not another disorder? Like, you
Yep.
can spin hard on that one.
Very much so. And to this point that you're bringing up, it very easily dovetails into obsessing about whether or not you have OCD, obsessions,
Mhm.
compulsions, etc. So, which, yeah, like the sort of meta OCD, which is very tricky because, it's like, oh, but what if this isn't even OCD? Which we'll
Yeah,
do. Yeah,
we'll do a whole 'nother thing.
we have
Whole
actually. I think we've done that at some point.
Okay.
Obsessing. Yeah.
I know.
We'll
We'll
probably do
probably
it
do that
again.
for
Yeah. 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 So yeah, so you've got the dissociation as a trigger, with like sort of emotional checking as a compulsive response.
asking for reassurance too.
Yeah.
Big
Yeah.
one.
Well, how do you see that coming up?
Well, I mean, the thing that's the most, uh, like, first thing to my mind is when I think last time when we spoke, you were sharing your own experience of it as a
Mm,
child
yeah.
and how asking for reassurance was a big piece of that.
Huge.
I think
Yep.
you can speak to that maybe a little bit here would
No,
be
that's
helpful.
totally fair. Yeah, I think just that I know that in my experience, the freneticism with which I would ask my mom or my dad, like, well, am I going to be okay? And what if will I go to heaven? What if I don't like heaven? All of that kind of stuff, like that. I just wanted an answer.
Mhm.
I wonder too, to some degree, at a certain point you realize that your parents don't have the answers, but when it was coming up for me, I was a kid, and so it made sense to ask them for lots and lots of reassurance. I imagine that in adults this happens more frequently. I mean, I don't have the numbers of it. I've certainly seen
Mhm.
this happening where we're asking clergy members for reassurance, or looking through. I think you were mentioning this earlier, like looking through religious texts and stuff like that. Well, no, you were saying Google, but same idea, right? Like I'm going to research um, to see what my faith says about this, or what philosophers have said about this. But yeah, I think for a lot of kiddos, it probably does look like, hey, mom, dad, how do I know that I'm real, or how do I? And I've certainly seen that with kid clients with this particular theme, that it
Yeah.
becomes like really fixating with a parent on and trying to have them answer the question.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So reassurance seeking for sure happens. It can happen with family members, it can happen with clergy members, which that's a tricky thing to navigate, I think, probably veering into the realm of more or of religious scrupulosity here.
Definitely.
But how if you have any thoughts on this, I'd be curious. How do you navigate helping people to have connection with clergy members, or, within their faith,
Mhm.
without necessarily becoming compulsive in their relationships?
Well, I think starting with step 1 of knowing that what your compulsions are,
Mhm.
right? Because when it first hits, you're like, "Oh, well, this makes sense that I would question this or try to get down to the bottom of this." And a clergy member may be like, "Oh, wow, look at they're very interested, they're devoted, they're trying to grapple with the hard questions." And so it could easily just right out of the gate spin out. So it's part of is just acknowledging I have compulsions and
Mm.
that piece of I also have control over this and I can choose to not do that. So that choice piece where a lot of people feel almost compelled and they say like as if the control is outside of them and it's not.
Right. Right.
It's the accountability to this, and also not avoiding, right? Because it could be, it's so much and I don't trust myself, and I'm just gonna avoid going to whatever religious, um, worshiping temple or church
Yeah.
that you go to, is that it's going to be really maybe holding yourself accountable, doing things based on values,
Mm.
and talking about things that maybe aren't related to that or in a paced way.
Yeah. No, that's well said. I think that this element of on some end, people are avoidant and some people are more tend toward that reassurance seeking is an important thing to know about yourself too. So like knowing your compulsions, also knowing it if on the whole you veer away, like I don't want to think about this because it's triggering for me to go to church. I'm going to have all of these thoughts about whether or not I'm going to go to heaven or hell, or what the afterlife is going to be like.
Or I
And
couldn't talk to the clergy members at all too. Yeah.
right, or I can't because that's going to trigger things for me. Um, that the work is probably going to be in increasing contact, right? Like going to church or to synagogue or to a mosque or whatever the case may be, and talking to clergy members. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, if somebody has this tendency to want to ask and ask and ask, that for a time it might look like, okay, well let's draw back because your tendency is to over ask.
Mhm.
Um, and that the work of finding a middle ground, I think, is something that comes a little later in recovery
I
sometimes.
agree. I agree.
Um, but it's tricky too because that hooks into that whole obsessing about compulsing thing. Like, oh my gosh, but am I doing a compulsion by asking this question? And that's oftentimes what I think we end up having to work through with people,
Yes,
whatever extreme they're on.
that's true.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that work, I think, without an OCD therapist, that work in particular.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I would agree with that. And, this is where the work of exposure and response prevention is not completely manualized. It's not black and
That's
white.
yeah, it's not something you're gonna a post you're gonna read on, Instagram.
No. No, it's not.
I mean, the basics, but
Yes.
it's so nuanced. It really is.
Yeah. And obviously we believe in psychoeducation. Otherwise we wouldn't be doing this podcast
Right.
or and
Of
we wouldn't
course.
have advocacy platforms on social media, but there are limitations and recognizing where this stuff is inherently messy.
It is.
Yeah. When you're talking about things like, you know, the nature of reality and
Mhm.
and what happens after you die. They're
And
big questions.
meaning and purpose, and am
Yeah.
I being, am
Yeah.
I spending my time correctly?
Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting too, like I want to make a nod to here because I know we were talking about like the death stuff as being one of the ways this manifests, and I think it can be tricky because it can show up like depression or it can show up like OCD anxiety.
Hmm.
And it's not like those are mutually exclusive, but
Right.
understanding where your inclination may be to, on the one hand, worry or ruminate resolve it. And on the other hand, it may just be like, well, resignation. And I'm going to tell the story about how everything's messed up and never going to be okay. Um, does that make sense?
Well, can you give an example?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah. instead of just talking about this in the conceptual. That's a good
Yeah.
plan. Good call.
Okay.
So if somebody is afraid, like I see a fair amount of people who have fears related to losing a loved one,
Mhm.
right? Or who think about the loss of a close loved one. And I see that happening where I see in response to that, that sometimes people will just spin about like, well, what am I going to do when they die? And how am I going to be okay? And what, like, how can I make sure to establish everything so that I can handle this? And I'm talking about this, being not something that's likely to be imminent. Like it's not like right around the corner. No, somebody's not currently dying. Although it could
It
happen.
could, it could. Could even
Totally.
happen post, yes.
Yeah, for sure. But that it could come up that way of like, I'm trying to make sure that everything's going to be okay when that happens, or I'm trying to savor every single moment. I need to make sure, like, the sort of um, intense activity level around, I'm going to fix this versus
Activity level.
it's high with the intensity level, man.
Oh, good.
um, but on the other hand, that it's and that's sort of the anxiety response, that there's a tendency with this material to become depressive. Like, well, why even bother? Like, if they're going to die anyway, then what's the point of all of this? And I guess it's all meaningless anyway. And right, like, but there's no, you can hear that in that churning, there's no resolution to that. It's
No.
just, well, this is my
Well,
my lot in life.
your life's gonna get dark
Uh-huh.
quick that
Yeah.
way too.
No, I mean, my life just became dark just talking about that for 5
Yeah.
seconds. Um, but
Shit.
it's like, and the same thing happens, doesn't have to be about death. It could be about like, well, if we live in the matrix, then what's the point? If this is a simulation, what's the point? Um, and again, like it can come up in the anxiety, it can come up in the depressive side of things, it can come up in both. Usually when people ask me about that, I'm like, well, then I guess you just have to live your best simulated life,
Yeah.
Like, and I think that it's been important to me with these types of big ticket questions to have humor infused a little bit, because
Mhm.
it's like, well, I guess I'm really going to crush it in the matrix then,
Yeah.
but also just that, obviously that's terrifying. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
I don't like that idea. No, I don't either. But
Yeah.
and I'm jumping ahead because now we're talking about ERP. But
No, I mean, but this is how every episode
I
will
know.
be. It's gonna bleed into the next
Yeah.
inherently, so
Yeah.
how do you find it when you're trying to pull somebody from the dark side, if you will, or like that
The depth.
that forget it, like, "Screw it, I'm out."
Yeah.
Like, do you think it's more helpful to work on the depression
Mm.
first or simultaneously? Or because I imagine this is a common question people and also with treatment, a lot of people will go in for treatment to treat the depression, not knowing even it's
Right.
OCD.
Right.
And then a therapist isn't an OCD specialist, and they're like, "What in the heck is going on?" Um,
Yeah. And giving them tons of reassurance, like, well,
oh,
life
ooh.
is worth living and it's probably not a
Mhm.
simulation and etc. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I feel like I've been chatting a lot. I would actually like to, I mean, I'm happy to answer it, but I kind of want to reflect back to you and ask you what your thoughts are.
Hmm. So in my experience, and I think yours, we usually see both. Like that depression is on board and people can vacillate between the 2.
Hmm.
If they haven't gone through OCD before and this isn't their first like this is their first time around, let's
Yes.
say.
Yeah.
Because they don't know that on the other side of this there is recovery and it's possible. So I think when you get like the first rounders, that there's a tendency to have more of that depressive side, and it's harder to get them to buy into treatment.
Mm.
And that a lot of it is behavioral activation, like, we're gonna work on depression and then slowly pacing into the exposure stuff, depending on the person too, right? Like,
Yeah.
everybody's so different and
Yeah. To
but
your point, it may have to be in tandem. It may be the depression first. It may be the anxiety first, just depending on so many. different variables.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, should we break down behavioral activation? I'm sure we've talked about it on here before, but
Mhm.
fancy therapist speak for
So behavioral activation is it's kind of the protocol for treating depression, along with CBT. I almost said CBD, definitely not CBD. A little rusty here on the podcast.
Oh, good,
Um,
man.
so restructuring thoughts, but not OCD related, right? Like dealing with like depressive symptoms and I'm not good enough kind of stuff, like the
Yeah.
core beliefs. Um, Probably working on self-compassion,
Mm,
that's a big one. And then behavioral activation specifically is getting that person to get outside, have a routine, do things that like challenge them and activates them, right? So
yeah.
it's not like avoiding life and becoming stagnant and not leaving your house and not talking to anybody and becoming this very reclusive human.
Yes. Which, by the way, is a terrible way to get better when you're depressed.
So it's yeah,
Hanging out by yourself,
the
not
kiss of
connecting with
death.
the world, it's really
Yeah,
it's
so we're
not
gonna
mm-mm.
go outside and go for a walk and exercise and talk to people and walk
Yeah.
down the street to get coffee or whatever.
Yep, absolutely. And
Schedule.
yep, absolutely, because it does start to like with depressive episodes, it's like devolving into like there's no structure. It's just like life becomes this
Yeah,
blob,
black
it's
hole.
like
Yeah, yeah,
nebulous, difficult.
yeah.
So yeah, I think. Oh shoot, what were we just talking about before?
Behavioral
Blobs.
activation
Yes.
and then
Yeah. So I think structure is important. I think values are also important.
yeah,
So
definitely.
this is where looking at like, well, what kind of a person do I want to be and how does that person show up? And like, what are my larger goals and what things speak to me and excite me about life? That exploring that becomes really important too.
Even when you don't feel like it.
Hmm.
It's the
Hmm.
key to all this is
Yeah.
people think, "Oh, well, but I don't feel like doing that," or "I don't wanna have that experience while feeling sad."
Right, I have to address that first, and then we
Right.
can go from there, and it's like, "No, that's not really how it works." I mean, it's
The feelings.
CBT with depression is not so different from in that way, CBT with anxiety, because
Yeah.
we're not gonna talk yourself into not feeling anxious, just like we're not gonna talk ourselves into not feeling depressed,
Yeah.
We're
You have
gonna
to go get it.
exactly. You can talk to yourself about like, okay, well, what does it make sense to do here? But then you got to take the action, whether
Mhm.
or not you feel like it. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people say, "Well, I don't feel motivated," or "I'm waiting for the motivation to do it."
No. No.
But so now that we're talking about it, some of this behavioral activation stuff could be a good exposure in the OCD realm of,
Mm.
existential stuff or even, a pretty good trigger for some people.
Yeah. How will you give an
So
example of what you think?
simultaneously, you're like
Yeah.
treating the depression while treating the OCD. So it could be like, okay, I'm gonna go to church.
Yep.
Okay, because that's something I value and I want to have meaning and connection with people. And I'm also going to be scared because what are they going to talk about?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I'm going to question everything. And
Yep. And how do I and then practicing not trying to figure it all out is
yeah,
yeah, a part of being out in the world, which for whatever it's worth, it like talk about self-compassion or room for that because it's a lot of heavy lifting,
it is.
It's to say like, okay, we're going to ask you to like pick yourself up when you're feeling, depressed. You've got this like weight on you and it's like you're you're pulled down by a heavy blanket. And then also when you're out and about, you're going to get sort of like punched a little bit.
Huh,
So
it's so true.
good luck.
I have so much, um, I just feel so much for my clients when I'm asking them to do stuff like that because I personally, as do you, know how that feels.
Yeah.
And you just it's like, God, I know it's so brutal, but,
Yeah.
like, we gotta do it.
Yeah.
There's no other way.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
literally no other way. If there were, I would have done it, and I would be telling you what to do instead.
Well, and I'm the first person to talk through that with my clients. Like,
Yeah.
okay, well, let's look through the options here, because like if
Mhm.
there's a better option, by all means,
Let's
but
do
like
it.
let's do it. But like I've yet to have anyone come up with
'Cause I've
anything better.
tried
Yeah,
all of the
yeah.
options.
I've learned about all of the options. I've also tried all of the options. Yeah,
And at some point, and everybody's, hitting rock bottom, everyone's rock bottom looks a little different, and I think
yeah,
it takes a lot for people. It's such hard work and it's so scary that it
mhm,
does sometimes take rock bottom to get them to be like, all right, screw it. I've done everything. I've
yeah,
tried everything
yeah,
and it's not working. So I'm gonna just do this thing.
yeah. That's such a good point, and I think that that's true with every subtype. Is like
Yes, agree.
sometimes I'll even see people. I'm sure you do too. When they come in, it's like week after week I notice that they kind of revert to trying to resolve the
Yes.
uncertainty, trying to fix it, and it takes a few maybe sessions, maybe a little bit longer, to go like, I'm doing the same thing and it's not working and it
Yeah.
hasn't worked, and kind of pointing out to them like, okay, well, how's this serving you or not? um
Yeah.
yeah,
It's tough.
it is tough, man. It is. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's hard work. And, I think this subtype in particular has literally no like, it's just
Oh, I
so
know.
I mean, none of them have an answer, but I just feel like this is like, you aren't gonna get shit
No.
from anyone.
There's
Like,
nothing.
there is nothingness. Like, it
Yeah.
is just a hole
The greatest minds have been thinking over these questions for
for a millennia. Yeah.
ever. And it's not like there's no solid answer. Um,
Mm.
I don't think anyway. Not that I
A
found.
glitch in the matrix is a really good exposure, but we'll talk
Yeah.
about that next time.
We will. But I think, yeah, at the end of the day, maybe as we start to wrap up this episode on the compulsions, I think it's important to recognize how hollow the behaviors are. The fact that you really aren't getting any closer to an answer. And that's true
Mm.
with every subtype. It's, as you're saying, particularly true of this one. And so it becomes, okay, well, do you want to waste your life trying to resolve this question that you cannot possibly have an answer to?
Yeah.
Unless, I guess, Neo like
I mean, he
pops
shows
out
up.
and like asks you which pill you want to take. I don't know. Like
Right.
until that happens, there's no knowing. And so your choices are to continue to try and figure it out and miss out on whatever reality you happen to be living in, or to just dive in and
Mm.
accept that, like, it's like, who knows if this is real, who knows what's going to happen next, who knows when people are going to die and how I'm going to respond to it, or whatever iteration of this theme you may be dealing with.
Yeah. It's tough.
Yeah, it is. Any other like closing thoughts from your vantage point on this?
No, I think you did a great job. Just again, it's like this is a false control. It's not
No.
it's like you have to logically understand it's not getting you anywhere.
Yeah. And once you do, and once you really accept that, there's actually a lot of freedom,
There is. It's true.
a lot of fear too, but a lot of freedom.
Yeah.
Well, as always, my friend,
Yes.
I love that we get to talk about this together.
Yes.
It's special. And
Of course. Always.
thanks for joining, for those of
Yes.
you who did. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time in 2 weeks, right?
Yes. 2
Next
weeks.
time is 2 weeks. So we're going to do, as we sort of figure out, like my schedule is very much in flux with this new little person and then the holidays and
Yes.
everything.
Yeah.
So we will be back on Monday the 27th at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time. And yeah, have a great couple of weeks.
Yes. Adios.
Adios.